Hello and welcome to The Steamy, the Scotsman's politics podcast. I'm Alistair Grant, the political editor of The Scotsman. Freedom of information, the laws governing your right to access information, is a hot topic in Scotland at the moment, following high-profile legal wrangles with the Scottish Government. In today's podcast, I sat down with David Hamilton, the Scottish Information Commissioner, to talk about the so-called Salmond files, the Scottish Government's attitude to transparency, and David Hamilton's ideas to shake up Scotland's FOI laws. I think this was a fascinating conversation about an extremely important area, and I hope you enjoy it. David Hamilton, thank you very much for joining me on The Steamy. For those who don't know, can you maybe introduce yourself and describe exactly what the role of the Scottish Information Commissioner is?
Yes, certainly. And the Scottish Information Commissioner was a role created by Parliament in 2005 was when it became implemented. I'm the fourth Scottish Information Commissioner, and my role is to ensure that the rights of people to get access to information are upheld and to promote that regime. So it's very much a regulatory role, but also a promotion role in terms of people being able to access information from public authorities throughout Scotland.
And you've been in that role since October 2023. I mean, what have been some of the major challenges you've faced? Has it been what you anticipated? Has it been different?
Well, I used to be a former police officer, this is a totally different area of the law for me. It's been an absolutely fascinating journey, though. The variety of different cases which we get is quite extraordinary. And, the volume of requests is quite eye-watering. Last year we had about 110,000 information requests made to Scottish public authorities. And over the last 21 years, that's nearly 1.7 million. So this is a heavily used piece of legislation. And there's also a kind of mistaken belief that this is primarily the preserve of politicians and media in particular. But media only accounts for about 10% of requests. So most of the requests are coming from ordinary members of the people who want to understand why public services are working the way they are. And they also want to hold people to account for the decisions they make and have a bit of transparency about where their public money is being spent.
And there's been a lot of coverage recently about your ongoing legal wrangle with the Scottish Government over the so-called Salmond files. Now, this is really complicated, but for people who aren't familiar with this, it kind of broadly relates to freedom of information requests submitted mainly by Benjamin Harrop, a member of the public, who's seeking information around the 2021 investigation into whether Nicola Sturgeon breached the ministerial code over her handling of the Alex Salmond affair. And you previously found the Scottish Government was not entitled to withhold some of the information requested by Mr. Harrop. And after the government twice failed to comply with your ruling, you referred the matter to court. And last week, the Scottish Government was found in contempt of the Commissioner by the Court of Session for its unacceptable delays. The first time that's ever happened. What was your reaction to that? And how would you characterise the behaviour of the Scottish Government over this?
Yeah, this is a really complicated case. And so let me first of all make it clear that the Scottish Government has had its problems over many years with freedom of information, but in the last 2 or 3, it's really got its act together. And I commend, thanks to the work of my predecessors, to a situation that was much improved in general for the Scottish Government. And they get about 7,500 requests a year. And a lot of hardworking staff do a great job. However, when it comes to certain topics, the difficult ones, like the Hamilton inquiry, that's where it gets really challenging, shall we say. And it's quite been very frustrating, some of the legal shenanigans that have been pulled to try and not release information there, which ultimately most of that information is coming out now, but it's also splintered many different bits in different ways and sub-cases that have come off from the main request. We currently have, I think, about 3 or 4 appeals that are still live. I'm actually back in the Court of Session tomorrow for another, perhaps the most extraordinary of the appeals to date, to look at that request. And, it was very, to be honest, it's really wearing. I've got myself, my 11 investigators. I've got one lawyer in-house. Scottish Government has over 200. So we don't exactly have an equality of arms with this, and it does absorb a lot of our time trying to do it. So when we got the victory last week, in terms of, and I say victory, I mean that victory in terms of we managed to successfully bring forward a case despite everything that was thrown at us. And, I really welcomed that decision because it was quite damning about the way that the Scottish Government actually conducts itself, and in terms of freedom of information. And I think the wording that was used was quite punchy in terms of its saying that there was almost disdain for the Commissioner. And that kind of arrogance is what has been typifies the approach to particularly these Hamilton inquiry cases. And I don't know where that comes from, because it sits so far out from where most of the other kind of work that goes on is at. So yeah, very much welcomed it, and it certainly gave us a bit of a lift in terms of making it quite clear and asserting the authority of the Commissioner's office here in terms of making sure that we have those rights. Had we not been able to get this through, then essentially it would have been a free-for-all for people making their own deadlines and compliance, and that would have made a mockery of the law. So it was an important case to win in that regard.
And you used the word, arrogance there. Is that how you saw the Scottish Government's behaviour on this particular case, as a kind of arrogant approach by the government?
Yeah, all of the kind of appeals at the moment are very much attacking the office of the Commissioner. We know better. You should basically allow us to get on with it, and that is an arrogant approach. There's no question. The point about the Scottish Information Commissioner's role is that it's not a government role; it's an independent role, parliamentary official, and that kind of arrogance and we know better and so on is really not helpful. And it is disrespectful. I don't take that personally, but I do take it for the role which I'm the current post holder of. But it's important that office is respected, and I think they could maybe reflect a little bit better upon their approach in these cases.
And you mentioned you're not sure where that's coming from. I mean, is that, considering it's on this one topic, is that an attitude you've come across from them on other issues? I mean, do you think that's coming from the very top, John Swinney, or the kind of civil service? It just seems strange that, as you say, they'd be attacking your role over this particular issue.
I don't know where it's coming from. I have suspicions regarding some of the antics within the Scottish Legal Directorate, Scottish Government's Legal Directorate. I think what we saw in one of the previous releases of information was, clear advice not to take cases on, continuing to do so. And whether that's a failure of briefing, whether that's, people who are well briefed making decisions, I don't know. But it's really not, it's not it's important that government follows laws, and a government that, I think it was 2017, the First Minister said that they wanted to make this one of the most transparent governments that ever has been. And actually, we're rapidly running into the territory of one of the least transparent governments there's ever been. And that's a tragedy.
Yeah, do you think so? Just, because of issues like this, because of the ongoing court cases, when you say the least transparent government there's ever been, are you comparing it to kind of past examples in Scotland?
Well, just in terms of, I think where we've got to just now is, as I say, most of the stuff works, but where people judge this on is about the high profile stories. So you don't hear about success where people are getting information which they have asked for. And that's what that's why I started this bit to say that, the Scottish Government does respond well. It is a very good rate of putting information out in general, but that doesn't make a headline. What makes the headlines is the fact when you get the high profile cases where it's, wriggling away, trying to not release things And these are not compelling arguments. If they were, we wouldn't be in dispute. I understand fully the implications and the arguments which they're saying, but I don't accept them. And somebody's got to make that judgment call on it. And the problem is that the public judges on what they see, what's live at the moment, and this isn't adds to the bad look which we currently have in Scottish politics because of these high-profile cases.
And of course, I think part of the government's argument is that elements of the James Hamilton report, the report into Nicola Sturgeon potentially breaching the ministerial code, which I think ultimately found that she didn't, but parts of it would, for example, potentially identify the complainers in the Alex Salmond case, that this touches on contempt of court issues. I mean, I take it that's things that you weighed up and that you thought those arguments were not being legitimately used.
Yeah, I mean, we've looked through all these arguments, and on some occasions, we've said that information cannot be released because it could lead to jigsaw identification. I mean, to be honest, I'm not entirely clear how many pieces are left in this jigsaw because there are so many fragments of it that are out there. It's not too difficult to do already. But we're not going to add to that. We need to respect the court's orders in that respect. But what we've done is we've looked at this forensically and gone through it and tested each of these scenarios. So there are occasions when we've absolutely upheld the request not to the exemptions there, but there are other times where it's been overused, the exemption, and that's where we've changed it. But I mean, to be honest, some of these files have been so poorly handled that we've had 4 editions now of the most recent release of information where stuff has been put out by the Scottish Government that should not have frankly been put out because it was causing, leading to jigsaw identification. And that was only a few weeks ago. And this is the challenging environment here. Is it's difficult for people to work their way through it, but we have done that, and we're confident in our position on it because every single decision that I put out from this office, I have to think, can this be properly defended if somebody in the Court of Session, the highest court in the land, because that's the appeal route. So everything we put out, everything we say, that's the audience who I'm speaking to, as well as to the wider general public.
And what about moving away from the Scottish Government to kind of the public sector more broadly and all those kind of bodies that FOI applies to? I mean, how do they handle FOI in your opinion? Is there any concerns there? Is there any kind of areas that where you're getting pushback?
No, I think, first of all, the information professionals who deliver the information, they're absolutely committed to trying to help and assist and give people the information. And again, by and large, if you ask for information, about 47% of occasions, you will get all the information you've asked for. 75%, you'll get either all of that information plus or some partial information. So these are good figures in terms of getting access to that. The challenge comes in terms of volume, and where people are, where we see public authorities struggling just now is that when you have recruitment freezes and so on, people not being replaced, suddenly you get log jams building up because there's not enough resource to do these tasks. So that's the big challenge at the moment. Health is a particular concern at the moment, but equally it's one of our success stories because we've turned around 2 health boards in terms of their freedom of information responses already, Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Forth Valley, and they're now one of our best performing, both of them are one of our best performing authorities. So that's a good news story just by the work of the office here in terms of changing that. We're very alive to the challenges that happen in the public sector, and what we try to do is support them as much as possible. And sometimes that support means me having a conversation with the chief executive and saying, you can't go without this. This is a statutory legal duty you have. You can't just cut your number of information officers without there being a consequence. And the consequence is that you will fail to comply with the law. And that means I then have to take action, which will be worse. So it tends to work.
I wanted to touch on, last year you put forward the idea of making kind of 2 key changes to FOI law. One was the extension of the law to cover political parties. They're currently not included. This issue is obviously quite timely, given the kind of headlines over Peter Murrell's embezzlement from the SNP, the wider questions being raised about the party's governance, financial transparency. Why do you think political parties should be covered, and how do you see that working?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this is something I was speculating about last summer because I was aware that this happens in South Africa, where political parties fall under the Freedom of Information laws there. And it was kind of reinvigorated again just in recent weeks. First of all, because when the Parliament was elected, one of the questions I had was, how did these lists appear? So we have our constituency MSPs and we have our list MSPs. How does that happen? Now, when you're talking about lawmakers, there can be probably nothing that's got more public interest as to democracy and voting for people. So once you vote for a party, you don't necessarily know who you're getting as a representative of that party. And therefore, the actual how people are given seats and party lists and so on, I think there is a public interest to it, but there appears to be no consistency, no transparency from the parties as to how to get to that. Now, to be honest, if they did have much more transparent processes on this, then you wouldn't need to have that provision. But it was just an observation I made that in terms of democracy, there is a gap there. The funding thing is, to be honest, actually, when I made that point, I wasn't thinking about funding aspects of parties. But, since then, we've also had the Reform UK and Nigel Farage's donations, which, again, at least raise eyebrows, as to what was that 5 million for? What did you get back for that? What was the chain of correspondence regarding that? How was that policy formed? And actually, policy formation in itself, I think, it kind of couples nicely in with the Lobbying Act. That kind of how are people coming up with policies, and are people buying those policies from through political donations and so on? Now, that might be entirely okay, but let's just be open about it and upfront it. So that was the thinking behind the political side of things. It's not going to be everything in that sector, but I mean, that's not unusual because there are plenty of sectors where only certain parts of their business are covered by FOI. So candidate selection and party finances might be the two that stand out. There may be other things, maybe policy development, I don't know. But again, I just thought I'd put it out there. I have absolutely zero expectation of any politician voting for this. I mean, that is the proverbial turkeys voting for Christmas.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of politicians probably regret FOI in general, let alone opening the books of political parties. I think John Swinney was actually asked about this and was not keen on the idea, perhaps understandably. But your other suggestion was repealing, I hope I've got this right, repealing the section of the Freedom of Information Act which prevents appeals being considered by the Commissioner if they're in relation to the Commissioner itself or the Crown Office. Is that right? And why do you see that as important?
Yeah, so there's three elements to it. One is for the Commission. If somebody can't appeal one of my decisions to my office. Now, the only way they can go is the Court of Session, which is hugely expensive. And in terms of, it does seem a slightly artificial barrier down south in England and Wales. Well, in the rest of the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office has a firewall within their office, so they can examine complaints about themselves within their office. It's not an unusual mechanism. So that seemed, in terms of me being totally transparent and it being fair, that seemed to be appropriate. The other measures are for Procurator Fiscals and for the Lord Advocate's role as far as it relates to criminal prosecutions. And I think these are the two areas there which, again, when I brought this as forward a suggestion in my musings last year, I was thinking about the thing that, again, it triggered it was the legislation that was brought in to protect abortion clinics from inappropriate protests and so on. And a lady protester was arrested in what prima facie looked like a very clear case. And the lady in question was offered a formal adult warning, which she refused. which would normally take you on to court proceedings. But when it got to that stage, the Crown then said, no, we're not taking any further. Now, there may be good reasons for that. There may not be. But what I'm curious about is, from a public interest perspective, had somebody said to ask them, why did you not do that? Was that because of a problem with the law? Or were it private circumstances for the individual? Or what was the thinking behind that? Because at the moment, everyone's left thinking, what does that mean? And, my colleagues in Police Scotland are scratching their head thinking, what do we take from that? So that's my kind of thinking behind that. That there are high-profile cases where people will want to understand a decision. And again, if you're in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, you have the right to appeal one of these cases to the UK information officer, but not in Scotland. So essentially what this is doing is aligning us again with what we have in the rest of the UK. So the people have got that right. Now, that's not going to say that we're on the floodgates here, because the nature of these types of cases and the information held is very sensitive, and there would have to be a very large public interest argument and case to be looked at. But I mean, that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, and it can be tested, it can be looked at, and there will be occasions where the public interest is so large that people say, yes, we want to see that information. We need to understand that decision-making process. Now, that's not, I hasten to add, this is not on the reaction of what's happened in the last few weeks with regard to a particular high-profile case. It was a general observation, but there is a read across, of course, and people have perhaps taken more interest in it again since I mentioned that, or re-mentioned that from what I said last year.
Yeah, I mean, there's a total read across, as you mentioned, because there's so many questions around the Peter Murrow case, the decisions taken by the Crown Office, and you'd think that would be one that maybe there would be a huge public interest to actually understand the process there and address some of the speculation that floats around social media, because obviously we have a situation now where there's conversations going on online that people don't control, obviously, and you'd think that there'd be a public interest there in kind of understanding and explaining why decisions are taken when they are taken in that particular example.
Very much so, and I think this is the kind of frustration here, is that a lot of our institutions aren't keeping up with life and the world. So these types of speculative statements that go on social media spread like wildfire, and these institutions are totally flat-footed on it. And actually being a bit more proactive and open and transparent, and allows that to be done and people to have confidence in it. But it's we will decide, we are Crown approach is not very good. I don't think that's the accept thing. Well, we've looked at it and we've decided, and people are having these doubts regarding that. So a better way of doing it is being a lot more transparent in terms of the approach. And if you're not going to be transparent in your approach, then perhaps we need to look at other legislation such as FOI within that.
I mean, more generally, do you think there is an appetite for major FOI reform in this parliamentary term from the conversations that you've had? Do you think there's an appetite to go back in there and really amend the legislation in these quite key ways?
I think there's, I think we've got to be pragmatic about this. Katie Clark has got a reform bill coming through. It's quite technical in terms of these are not going to be earth-shattering things. It's probably quite pragmatic in terms of trying to get some changes done. So it's not going to be earth-shattering. Do I think people would look for, more broadly in the public, would have an appetite for change? I think they probably do. I think they'd like to see more transparency amongst organisations, but I don't think that's going to happen in this bill. And again, I don't criticise Katie for that. I think that's her being pragmatic in terms of trying to get essentially a kind of tightening of what we currently have. There is the possibility of scheduling in other organisations. I'd also like to frankly see the tribunals, not the tribunals, the public inquiries covered by FOI. They're not currently done so. And that's not to undermine those organisations, it's to look at the corporate function, because if you're talking at, let's say, the Shaker Bio inquiry and it's at £50 million plus, I think people might be entitled to find out what on earth is that money going on. Is this all just onto lawyers, or is it onto, well, what is it? Is it buildings? Is it, what on earth is that money being spent on? And there is no provision for that. And I know certainly some journalists have been probing us to, so how can that be? But are getting nowhere, because there's no, you're at the whim of what the public inquiries want to give out, as opposed to what you think you should be entitled to see.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly remember as a journalist trying to get some of those answers around the Edinburgh Tram inquiry and just getting absolutely nowhere, because they'll tell you what they want to tell you and nothing more. And there's nothing you can do about it, particularly when there was the delays in that inquiry.
I think what we're talking about there is,
I wanted to ask just finally, I mean, there's been...
So what we're not doing is, yeah, what we're talking about is corporate functions here. It's not about undermining the inquiry by asking for evidence and so on. It's asking about allowing it to do its job, but at the cost of these inquiries is so great. It seems to be one of the few things that is not covered by FOI in the country that is of such enormous, price tags on it, and I think that needs to change.
And just finally, I mean, there's been coverage in recent days about your move to cap the number of FOI appeals that any individual can lodge at the same time. I wanted to ask you about the thinking behind that, but I was also quite struck by, I think, a comment made by a spokesperson for your office suggesting that AI might be being used to make appeals and that's added to the increase in volume. Is artificial intelligence being used here? Is it a problem?
It is a problem, yeah. We've had an increase since in the last year of 83%. Our caseload has gone up. So it's gone, normally it's in 600, it's now over, it's nearly 1,100. It's absolutely astonishing growth. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. The higher profile of FOI is certainly driving it. People are beginning to see how they can use it, which is good. But we're also seeing it getting used and perhaps abused by AI. We heard yesterday from the UK Information Nurse Office that about an eighth of requests that they're dealing with have started off as a prompt from AI, inspired by AI. So somebody asks a question about public service, they don't get the answer because the AI doesn't know, and it says, "Would you like me to prepare an FOI request?" Yes. It goes away. It's responded. We don't have the information. Right? Do you want me to respond saying that's not good enough? Yes. Off it goes again. And then, do you want me to appeal to the Scottish Information Commissioner? Yes. Oof. So in 3 keystrokes, suddenly you've generated this problem. So that's one aspect of it, which we just have to deal with and work our way through. But what we also do is we have been flooded with sort of almost what I would call a mega requests, where we had last year, we had 2 individuals had submitted 120 requests between them just in a matter of weeks. It's a third of my normal full office caseload in 2 weeks. Now, the material they're asking for just would have meant that for 3 months, everybody else who had an appeal for FOI couldn't get anywhere near it. Now, as it happened, we didn't need to use that provision, but we found them to be invalid or vexatious or frivolous on those occasions. So they didn't progress. But it did ring the alarm bell. Had they not, then we need to have some kind of measure to protect the whole system, so that when you put a request in, you're not having to wait 3 months before we even look at it, because we're having to deal with a whole lot of machine-generated appeals. And that's what they are, it's machine-generated. We can't fight machines with machines, because the nature of the law, the nature of the nuance of FOI, it needs a human input to it. So that's not an option either. So this measure was essentially not capping it in terms of preventing people and applying. It's just saying that if on certain occasions we felt we were in that situation again, whether for AI or some other system abuse, getting used, that we could put some capping on it to make sure that other people get access to our service. And we have a conversation with the person who's put the stuff in and says, like, what's your priority here? Because we cannot do 70 freedom of information appeals for you. You're going to get 5. What are your top 5? And have a discussion with that to take them through in an appropriate, proportionate way. It's not a policy that's been used yet, but it's important to have it in place should we need it. So that's the background to it. What it certainly is not is stopping people from applying. We will get to them all eventually. It just might take a while if there's 70 machine-generated ones. That might be years before we get to that. But I think that's again where people have to have their own responsibility as to how they take this. Campaigners, journalists, anybody else who puts in more than 5 are not going to be triggered by that. That's quite clearly something different. So it's a discretionary power, primarily aimed at protecting the system from machine-generated applications. There may be other occasions where people do it. We do get quite a broad mix of people who apply. Some people are quite obsessive about things, and we get way too many applications from them, and we need to have a conversation with them. We discuss our cases with them, and usually they're amenable to changing, and we get them the outcome they're looking for through a bit of discussion. But again, some people are not necessarily up for discussion. So again, we needed to have these kind of measures that are there for it. So I think it's perhaps one of these ones that maybe a little bit misunderstood by people, but it's certainly there trying to protect the whole regime. It's not capping anything per se. It's just controlling demand running through the system.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. I think you were saying the UK commissioner was saying that 1/8 of the appeals that they're dealing with are AI generated. Is that? I mean, how many do you think have you come across as 1/8? Do you recognise that?
So it was 1/8 are AI inspired. So I think they said just over 12% was AI inspired. So it's. I mean, if I was to say how many potholes are there on the roads of Edinburgh, and Edinburgh City Council does not publish that information, then it says, I can't find that information. Do you want me to put an FOI request in? And I've had this myself where I've asked, an AI a question. I says, do you want me to send an FOI request? Now, that's a real problem because would somebody have done that anyway had it not been for, yes, one button and you're away. And then it's the whole automation starts. And the concern here is that there's no human input, there's no cerebral thought into this. This is us talking to machines. The Financial Conduct Authority recently put out a 16-page decision where they were dealing with, they had a 200-page submission about it. And you're thinking that's absolutely disproportionate to what they were dealing with. But this is all AI that's not just making reams of pages for the regulators to have to look at, but it's also hallucinating. So we've had decisions that refer to my previous decisions, which don't exist. It's been misinterpreting things. And that, again, a pretty dim view on as to how do we control that to make sure that we're not spending lots of time having to reference check every single piece, because it's not fair on other people who are trying to use the service here which we're providing.
What proportion of appeals that you deal with then do you think are AI inspired or have the involvement of AI?
I don't know, and we're about to going to do some further research on this. We've had, I think, actually, and this is literally a 24-hour snapshot. One of my guys said that we had 9 appeals come into the office yesterday, and 6 of them admitted that AI was used to generate the appeal. So that was just on our web form. So we're trying to capture that data. So 2/3 of yesterday's appeals that came through the web portal were AI inspired, generated, influenced. Now, let's be clear, AI has got a role to play in terms of it as an assistive technology for people who need it. But a lot of people will use it, and I think they think they're being very clever using it. Actually, it's not, because we can spot the patterns straight away. That there's got telltale formatting, telltale requests, total lack of humanity. So that you never get a thank you from an AI. Well, that's not a surprise, it's a machine. But again, a lot of people don't understand what it is, what it's doing, how it works. And I think that's one of the challenges here. This is a kind of machine that has been put out into the wild. You can't do a Google search now without being asked, getting an AI response to it from Google Gemini. It's integrated to everything we do. It's in Microsoft, it's in Adobe. Everything has this embedded now. And it's far, far too easy for folk to ask a question using these things and suddenly get driven down a route. So there's a broader conversation which I'm going to be speaking to government about and to other regulators about, to try and see, can we have almost an acceptable standard here as to how we interact with the public when we're faced with this AI issue. When I raised it at the Parliament in February, the MSPs were very sympathetic because they saw it in their own offices. They're getting hit with AI and they know the problem. So we need to get ourselves into a position that is that people have confidence as regulators, as public authorities, where what they can and can't do in terms of response to some of these queries. And perhaps more broadly, I've done work in Ukraine, speaking to the Ukrainians there, saying that they are now getting denial of service attacks by FOI. So essentially, they're getting a lot of foreign state actors, i.e. Russia, sending in FOI requests to the public authorities in Ukraine to try and swamp them with material so that people can't get to things. It's happening in America as well, in American politics. So it is a matter of time before this type of threat comes to Scottish organisations, and we need to be ready for that, have the tools ready for that and the policies ready for that, because otherwise it's going to catch us and bite us.
Yeah, it's a fascinating issue, and obviously AI is here to stay in many ways, but it drives me up the wall when you're trying to use Google and it starts interfering, or when you're trying to write an email, it starts making pointless suggestions. But David Hamilton, thank you very much for your time. It's fascinating to talk through some of these issues. As journalists, we're always interested in freedom of information, but I think given some of the headlines recent days and weeks, it's an issue that is very much in the spotlight. So thank you very much for making the time to speak to us.
Very welcome. Thank you.
That was David Hamilton, the Scottish Information Commissioner, and that's all we've got time for in today's podcast. But we'll be back at the same time next week. And in the meantime, please stay tuned to the Scotsman's website for all the latest news, comment, analysis. Please do pick up a copy of the paper as well. And why not consider subscribing for full access to the Scotsman's content? Thank you very much.